Yeah, hi everyone. Welcome to week 6 of CERIAS Security Seminar. We have Chance Younkin from Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. So Chance leads the software and system security analysis group with project ranging from a lot of fascinating things like nuclear radiation monitoring systems. He is like passionate and very experienced in cybersecurity. So I would recommend like Chance, please go ahead. We are really excited to have you with us.
Okay, well, thank you. And I really appreciate the introduction, Imtiaz, and happy to be here and happy to be able to talk to you all. And um, my name is Chance Younkin. I've been at Pacific Northwest National Lab since 1991. That's where I came to work after I graduated college. I went to Montana Tech in Butte, Montana, got a degree in computer science and was very heavy on math and decided that my computer science background was a little bit weak. So I went to Montana State and got a master's degree in Bozeman, Montana. And then I've been out here ever since. There's been a few times I've almost left the lab, but there was always a reason to keep me here. One of the main things I really like is the diversity of opportunities here, um, because while keeping the same employer and living in the same town for these past 33 years, I have changed jobs a lot. Um, I started out working on developing software to support the Air Force back in the early 90s. Nowadays we hold up our cell phone and we say, hey, get me a route to Pacific Northwest National Lab, and boom, it's all navigated for you. That was the kind of thing we were doing for the Air Force back in the early 90s, for them to be able to put computer screens of maps for their flight patterns. They wanted to be able to navigate canyons, low flying um, missions where they wanted to stay low undetected. So I worked on software for the panning and zooming of maps and things like that for the Air Force cockpits. And then supported a lot of science through the years, wrote a lot of code to help with atmospheric research, data quality for instruments pointing at the sky, collecting data about temperature, pressure, cloud density, cloud water percentages, all trying to answer the global warming questions, back in the 90s when that started to become a thing. I'm not a climate scientist, but I got to learn what they look like, what they do, by writing software to help them do their job, basically. Moved from that into molecular science and visualization. Um, I've had a lot of experience writing code that was visualizing molecules and their electromagnetic fields so that scientists could determine the properties of different kinds of molecules they were studying, whether that was for polymer science to make plastics better or ceramics better or whatever it is they were studying. Crystallography was kind of the name of the science, the crystal molecules. And then worked on a lot of software lifecycle tools before those things really were prevalent like they are today. And at the lab, there was a lot of scientists who weren't software engineers. So we put together some engineering tools for them and helped with the software lifecycle so that scientists could write their code and we could put it into some sort of rigorous engineering process to help, eliminate bugs and things like that, so that the science code was a little more engineered than it would have been otherwise. So supporting the scientists and the science from that perspective. Those software development lifecycle tools kind of caught on. And this is the early 2000s when 9/11 happened. If any of you were alive at that time, if not, you probably remember the history of that. We had just stood up here at the lab a pilot, very small scale cybersecurity monitoring program, and it was experimental. And then 9/11 happened, and it went from being a small experiment to being a big, highly funded network traffic analysis program for doing cybersecurity so that we can monitor networks across the Department of Energy over the different facilities and complexes of that, looking for anomalies, looking to find adversarial behavior and things like that, back in the early days of cybersecurity. And when they started to develop that system, instead of with the atmospheric stuff, there were a lot of instruments pointing at the sky, collecting data for atmospheric. Well, in this new cyber program, there were a lot of instruments on Department of Energy's networks, collecting data about the network. And so the lifecycle tools we had developed became important in the cyber world from that perspective. So we got recruited to do that. And that was kind of my introduction to cybersecurity. So a long time ago, a lot of history there. And before those times, cyber was really not anything talked about. I certainly didn't get an education in it like you all can do now, getting degrees and studying it and making it part of your curriculum. There was no such notion back when I was in school or even working here for the first, 20 years of my 34-year career. So all that to say, I did a lot of software, and then I got into cybersecurity in the last 15, 18, 20 years. And I've now blended my experience of software development with my experience in cybersecurity. And that's kind of where this Shamrock Cyber thing comes in. It's something we've had around for a little while. And that's what I wanted to share with you. And I'm very happy to be doing that. So given that little bit of context and that little bit of history, I'm going to start moving on. Please stop me at any time if there's a question. And Mike, if there's something in the chat, please just stop me. Okay, so I'm going to give you an overview of what Shamrock Cyber is. It's a program we have here at PNNL. And by the time we're done talking today, I'm hoping that you will see why Shamrock Cyber exists. You will know what Shamrock Cyber is. And hopefully you will get the basic concepts. I'm not going to go into the details of all the kinds of analyses that we do and the engagements we perform and how we get into the details. I'm going to give you an overview of all of that. And I'm also hoping that you'll learn kind of some of the other activities that have come out of the Shamrock Cyber efforts that we've had here. So those are the kinds of things I want to cover. And I want you to kind of look at it from if I were to get a job at PNNL, this is the kind of thing I might work on. And I'm going to talk about it as, what are we doing and how are we doing it? But I realize a lot of you are students, so that's a good way for you to look at this. I want to mention too that we've had several Purdue students as interns over the years. All of them have done an outstanding job. I think Haris is on the line. He and a lady named Angela Steinmetz were our first two interns from Purdue. Met them through the career fair, 5 years ago or so. Excellent interns. Haris has done a fantastic job, and then he's off now getting his PhD. We hope to bring him back. A fellow by the name of Jacob Beeman did an internship with us a couple of summers, and just this past summer, he started his full-time job here at PNNL. So I'm very passionate about Purdue recruiting. I really love the university. It's a top school, and it's really nice for me to be able to be here. Okay, so that's what we'll talk about. That's what the perspective is that I'm hoping you can have, and let's keep moving on. So the first thing I said we'd talk about is, why does Shamrock Cyber exist? Well, the main thing is there's a lot of adversaries that are doing nasty things. That's what that picture on the left shows. And then the picture on the right shows that there's a lot of money that's being spent trying to keep those adversaries from doing those things. Let's talk about some examples, probably some things that you're very familiar with. This first thing, head in the clouds security. There was a company called FlexBooker. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's a very popular calendar tool, high profile scheduling service, basically. And just before Christmas in 2021, 3 million users were compromised. Adversaries were able to capture sensitive data like driver's licenses, photos, other forms of ID. They posted all this information on various hacker forums, and it was they exploited an AWS configuration to execute their breach. So the point there is, a lot of us these days are saying, hey, the cloud is now where we can go, and it is a good place to go. I'm not saying it isn't, but putting things out in the cloud instead of being on-prem does not buy automatically that you're going to be secure and safe from all of this. They exploited AWS to make this happen. So then we have this gateway security, or maybe it's gateway insecurity. It was a German company, and they were in the building automation business. So think of a platform of software that lets you control the heating and cooling systems or the lighting systems of a building, or maybe multiple buildings. This building management system lets someone sit at a computer like I am right now and say, hey, you know, nobody's been in Chance's office for a long time. Let's just make sure the lights are off. Or let's check the sensors to make sure that the lights are behaving accordingly. Or let's turn the temperature down, all from within an office on a computer screen. That's basically a building automation system. German company doing that lost contact with hundreds of its building automation devices. They lost contact with light switches, motion detectors, window shutter controllers. And all these smart devices were basically taken over by an attacker. And it was the security mechanisms that they used to gain access to the system. So the folks that put these security measures in place were not really thinking like an adversary. They were thinking from a defender perspective. And that's part of what we're going to talk about with Shamrock Cyber, is thinking like an adversary. So situation unawareness. There was a breach at crypto.com. Attackers gained access to 483 crypto.com wallets and stole $18 million in Bitcoin, $15 million in Ethereum. And they were able to bypass two-factor authentication to make this happen. And the businesses were not aware of the risks associated with cryptocurrency. So there's a lot of new technologies, but security is not just simply solved. And there's a lot of adversarial behavior doing a lot of adversarial things. So that covers the adversary side. Let's talk a little bit about the money side. The cyber insurance market is a fairly new thing. In 2021, $8.5 billion was spent on insurance. It's projected next year that will be up to almost $15 billion, and then by 2031, $34 billion as an insurance industry for cyber protection. So a lot of money being spent on insurance. Cybercrime cost. The cost of dealing with a breach or an action by an adversary was around $3 trillion 9 years ago. 4 years ago, it was $6 trillion. Next year, it's expected to be $10.5 trillion. So there's a lot of money being spent just dealing with the problem. And globally, cyber spending during these current years per year is up around $1.75 trillion on just global cyber spending on how are we going to prevent things. This is not the same as the cost of dealing with problems in the previous bowl. This is the cost of just what are we trying to do to get better at defending, kind of a thing. Has anybody heard of the Vegas casino story? It's an old story from 2018. Okay, so I'm going to just assume nobody has. This is an example I really like to use for telling just what can happen. 2018, a Las Vegas casino. I don't know if they published the name of the hotel, but if they did, I've forgotten it. But there was a very elaborate and beautiful fish tank in the lobby of this casino, and a lot of exotic fish, saltwater fish tank. There's like 30,000 gallons. I don't know. It was a very big tank. It wasn't just a little fish tank. It was a big centerpiece of a very big lobby. And there was a thermometer in this fish tank, and it could be monitored remotely to see what the temperature was in the fish tank. So I could be, if I was the person managing this fish tank, I could just look at the temperature from anywhere in the hotel or from my house with some kind of device on my phone, an application, and I can monitor the temperature of that fish tank through the thermometer. To be able to do that, the device had to be able to contact the thermometer, which means the thermometer had an IP address and was on a network. Well, it turns out that some hackers were able to get into the hotel casino's network through the thermometer and actually exfiltrate data out through the thermometer. The thermometer was the gateway for them to steal information from the high rollers database. So the high rollers being, the very wealthy people who do a very high stakes gambling. They've now got their information exfiltrated through the thermometer in the fish tank. So when we say, why does Shamrock Cyber exist? It's basically to make a dent in all this spending and all this behavior that those of us on the good side don't want to see happen. So we're trying to find ways to mitigate things, to bring the cost down. Not saying we're solving all the problems all the time, but we've found a niche that we feel applies very well for helping projects become more secure in their software development efforts through what Shamrock Cyber offers. So that's the why. So let's talk a little bit about what it is in general. So right now, I'm going to take 30 seconds or so and be quiet. And I want you to just read this sentence, and then we'll kind of go from there. Okay, so the reason I bring this sentence up is because I want to define a few terms without having to spend a whole lot of time on it. So, consequence analysis. Dooming IGNO to the unemployment line is what we call a consequence. So there's a lot of things that we could call consequential. There's a lot of things that we could use to define this in many different ways. But we're looking at this particular sentence and saying the laptop being unlocked or spoofing an email is not a consequence. The person losing their job is the consequence. That's this bad thing that can happen. The threat, there's a lot of ways to talk about threats. We talk about adversaries being threats. We talk about the weapons they have as being threats. In our context, and I'm not saying we have it right and everyone else is wrong, I'm saying we've got to pick a context in which to speak about it, and this is the one we've chosen. So when we do our work, we define these terms so that people can know when we give them results, this is the context we're in, and then they can put it back into their own context. But without doing that, there's a lot of ambiguity, a lot of assumptions that get made that don't get talked about if we don't say what we mean by threat. And so what we mean here is the spoofing of an email. So this person named Vin is not the threat, it's what he does, spoofing an email. That's the threat that can lead to IGNO being unemployed, the consequence. Next word up is vulnerability. The laptop being unlocked is how we look at vulnerabilities. So the laptop being unlocked does not lead to a bad thing happening unless someone takes advantage of it. So the laptop unlocked is a vulnerability on which the threat can be exploited and leads to that consequence. And you'll see as we've been talking about this, I'm building up this thing, consequence analysis, threat analysis, and vulnerability analysis. And those make up the three elements of what we call Shamrock, and you're probably starting to see why we call it Shamrock. So that's consequence, threat, and vulnerability defined in this sentence. I want to talk now a little bit about what it is we're trying to do. The first thing we're trying to answer some basic questions, and there's a lot of analysis and complexity that goes into it, but really we're trying to answer some simple questions. The first one here is, what is the context and what is the value? And we call that first contact. And it's not just because we needed a stem for the Shamrock, although we did. And that's nice that we were able to come up with one, but really first contact is very important. It's kind of what I'm doing with you all right now, explaining what Shamrock is and why it might be useful to a project. This is kind of what we're doing together right now. But the idea is, hey, if we're going to talk to that German building management system company, they need to know what we do, and we need to know what their context is and what they're looking for, and to see if there's going to be value in the kinds of analysis that we do. So we talk about what we do, we talk about what they do, we talk about their mission, et cetera, all to answer this question: what is the context and what is the value? Then we move on to consequence analysis, and that's where we talk about what happens when things go wrong. So it's not the thing that goes wrong, it's what happens when it goes wrong. We kind of already been through that, the ending up in the unemployment line. Consequence analysis is really talking about that level of thing, high level, bad things that can happen. We're going to go into a little more detail here in just a little bit. What can go wrong and can we stop it? That is the threat analysis. Spoofing an email is what can go wrong. And so how might we want to stop that? And that's where threat analysis comes in. Fourth question here is, what enables those bad things to happen? So when something does go wrong, how did it happen? Well, the laptop being unlocked is what enables it. If that was not the case, then Vin probably didn't have an opportunity to spoof an email, at least not as easily as it was when the laptop was left unlocked. So that's what we're talking about in vulnerability analysis. What enables the bad things to happen? Then we talk about adversaries and users. And when we start to talk about consequences, threats, vulnerabilities, adversaries and what they're doing and who they're doing it to, the users, that's when we start trying to wrap consequence, threat, and vulnerability wrapped all around into mission risk analysis. That is sort of the grand finale of Shamrock activities, is we have a risk analysis based on consequences, threats, and vulnerabilities that we can then give back to a project for them to mitigate their risks. So that's generally what it is in a nutshell. That is Shamrock Cyber. Do I have any questions yet?
You have a couple comments. Andrew said, yeah, he heard of the IoT fish tank attack. And Christopher Malloy mentions the MGM attack from last year, which shut down a lot of the casinos, right?
Yep. Yep. All right. Very good. Okay. With no questions, I'll keep going then. I think I will. There we go. So let's talk a little more detail about each of these things. I'm going to kind of keep peeling back and going a little deeper with each slide here. So the basic concepts. What is consequence analysis? First off, we didn't start from scratch a few years back when we got going on this. We built off of some standards. Most of you have a good chance of having heard of these different organizations. MITRE has their attack matrix, where you can learn about techniques, tactics, and procedures of adversaries. We do a lot of our work based on the MITRE attack matrix. I'll talk a little bit about how we do that. Microsoft has their STRIDE model, spoofing, which we've already talked about, tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, and elevation of privilege, STRIDE. We use that STRIDE model. NIST's cybersecurity standards and cybersecurity framework we base a lot of things on that. And then Lockheed Martin, way back when we first started this, had a process that we started out using, and then we've adapted it an awful lot since then. But it's still a good thing to point out where some of this stuff has come from. So we've got a lot of things that have been out there for a long time that we're making use of for all of these, the purple, orange, blue, and the mission risk in green. But let's talk about what consequence analysis entails. It first talks about the unacceptable outcomes, meaning what are those bad things that can happen. And when we go into any of these analyses, that means we're now sitting down with, I guess I'll call them a customer, but that's not really the right word. Just we engage with projects here at PNNL. We have also engaged with industry and on projects that they're working on. To go through these different analyses, and we sit down with them. Shamrock has a very heavy engagement process. It's not simply a software tool that's running and producing things. There's engagement involved in talking to people, especially in the consequence area and the threat area. So we sit down and ask them, what are the things that keep you up at night? What are your top fears? And for example, in a building management example, if we install a building management system in a stadium that has hockey games, unacceptable outcome is somebody hacks the system, turns up the heat, and all the ice melts. And now the hockey game gets canceled, and it happens over and over again because we can't solve it. And now the stadium owner, the team owner, is going to sue whoever built the building management system. That, when we worked with with a company, that was their biggest fear. It's a real world example that they gave us, and it's okay to share it because they're very public about it. But that's the example of an unacceptable outcome. Going into the unemployment line, the ice melting. We have a conversation about that, and we talk about ranking those fears so that we can say these are the most concerning things. And we'll talk about why we care about that later. Motivations and environment is another topic of discussion when we're doing consequence-based analysis. And here we're talking about who might the adversaries be and what might their motivations be. We want to help the person we're working with or the team we're working with. We want to help them understand why might these bad things happen? Why might there be adversaries, and what might motivate them? If somebody is a competitor in building management systems, they might want to take this down. Or if, I'm a fan of the Seattle Kraken, not the Toronto Maple Leafs, so I'm going to try and melt the ice in Toronto, kind of a thing. Things like that. I'm obviously using silly examples, but I want to make the point here of what might motivate someone to do something to your system. And we want to talk about that because it's not something development teams and stakeholders necessarily talk about. Then lastly, we talk about abuse, misuse, and hazard cases. And here is an example of an abuse case is, let's say we're on a warehouse floor and there's a robot that is moving packages around. Abuse, well, let's talk about a use case. A use case, the robot's going to take a package off the conveyor belt, put it on the shelf. That's a use case. The robot is going to take a package off the conveyor belt and drop it on the floor. That's an abuse case if somebody hacks the robot to make that happen intentionally. So intentional abusing of a functioning system, that's an abuse case. And then a hazard case is power goes off in the building because of a lightning strike and the robot doesn't do anything until the power comes back on. So not an abuser, not a misuse. I guess I didn't explain misuse. That's I accidentally tripped over the power cord and pulled the plug and the power went out because of me tripping. The lightning strike is hazard. And those are the three cases we talk about, and we deal with each of those separately. And we're trying to use those different perspectives to broaden the range of things that could happen to lead back to those unacceptable outcomes. So we engage a project or a team or a set of stakeholders to talk about these things. We document them, and then we move on. So that's the high level what a consequence-based analysis is. I'll talk a little bit in a minute about how we go about that. But for now, threat models. A threat model is basically, let's say, a network diagram, and it shows the system and how it's built and where these stride types of threats can happen. And we have threat findings. After we have a threat model, we can develop threat. We can look through it and categorize and come up with threat findings based on stride. And then lastly, here is threat mitigations. So, what are we going to do about it? As we move on to vulnerability analysis, we talk about structural security. In the case of software, this would be your source code repository, right? The code's not running, it's not doing anything, but there is the code and it's sitting in the repository. We do a code scan, and that is structural security, how the thing has been built. So the source code. If we're talking about something outside of software, then there would be a different thing. It would be, the the equipment as it sits. Can we find things security-wise wrong with that piece of equipment? For the next step, it's operational security. Now we're talking about how does this system or software function in terms of its operation when it's running. So in this case, if we have code that say it's a website, there's a web server and there's interactions going on, then we can do a scan using some dynamic application security testing tools and see how this thing behaves in operation and look for issues and vulnerabilities through that. So structural security is how the thing's built. Operational security is how the thing behaves when it's running. And then lastly, we have security testing, which is kind of a catch-all, but this is about kind of take structural and operational into account. But also we want to really drive home, there's requirements with a set of software. And traditional software testing is, does it meet the requirements? Security testing is, does it do absolutely nothing else besides what's in the requirements? And so, back when I first got into software development, we didn't think about that, right? If we met the requirements and the thing did what it was supposed to do, we released it. And nowadays, if you don't think about the things that it can do, but you didn't think to put in requirements because you didn't care whether it did them, those are now very big deals because of, the thermometers in the fish tanks and those kinds of things. So security testing is all about, does the thing do only what it's supposed to? And then that all ties into discovering and reducing risk. And I'm going to save some of that stuff for a little bit later and we'll talk about it. So those are the basic concepts. And now I want to kind of, in the next 10 or 15 minutes, kind of run through some of the details, and then we'll have a little time for questions after that. So consequence-based analysis, this is where we're trying to identify plausible pathways to unacceptable outcomes. So in this case, we're not going to talk about misuse and hazard because they're kind of analogous. We're going to talk about an adversarial context. So picture this person is an adversary looking at this system, trying to find ways to attack it and create an unacceptable outcome. So we talk about adversaries and their motives. We've already mentioned that. What we haven't talked about yet is what I want to go through. We have talked about it sort of, but I'm going to go into just a little more detail. Functional use elements. That is the term we use for what is the thing supposed to do. And so when we're doing an engagement, we sit down with the development team and talk to them about what is the system supposed to do. And we use their requirements documents, but we also have a conversation and record what is the functional use element. This is that robot putting a package from the conveyor belt onto the shelf. We don't want to go down into the technical details of the protocols that are being used and the languages of the software. We're just talking about how is it supposed to behave. Then we talk about abuse elements. And again, here we're not talking about technical things. We're talking about putting the package on the floor instead of on the shelf so that the factory floor gets backed up and the warehouse floor can't function. That's an abuse element. We want to list those. We list the FUEs, we list the FAEs, and then we start to talk about technical abuse elements. And now we're starting to talk about the technical aspects, the protocols, given these abuse elements and given these use elements, what are the things that could possibly be done? And this is where MITRE starts to come in with the attack matrix. And we do a lot of research into taking the abuse elements we've been given and the requirements that we've been given and going out and learning what's going on in MITRE and the attack matrix and our own subject matter experts and their expertise in addition to MITRE and along with MITRE to come up with technical actual methods for doing things. That's what leads to our abuse case, where we define a scenario that, hey, given this unacceptable outcome, these are the abuse elements where the unacceptable outcome could happen, and these are the technical means by which they might occur. That's our use case with a scenario. These become part of our list of artifacts, and that becomes what we call a consequence profile. So it's made up of all of these different things. We have a consequence profile, and then that is something we can deliver to stakeholders, to architects, and to development teams. And the idea being that we have sections in these documents that are designed specifically to communicate to these different audiences, because stakeholders may not know the technical means for which something might happen, but they sure do understand, I don't want the ice to melt. And so we talk about, we might mention technical details in the stakeholders portion, but it's really a side note to them to say your ice can melt by this functional abuse element. And hey, here are the technical means that you don't need to read or understand, but here is the list of them, so that they can say, okay, I know what the technical folks are going to want to fix when they come and talk to me about what they want to fix. And so this provides an adversarial context in the proper terms for the audience and establishes the foundation for doing risk assessment from a consequence perspective, and a common communication mechanism, because in a lot of instances, when we have a lot of experience with talking with people where the technical vulnerability management people or the people running code scans go and talk to stakeholders or CEOs and just say, here is a bunch of vulnerabilities we got to fix. And the stakeholder will say, why should I care? And the technical person has not always been able to articulate that. Well, now, because we're talking about these unacceptable outcomes that we talk to the stakeholder about and can map down, there's now this communication base that we can provide. And then this is just showing that that's analogous for misuse and abuse. Misuse and hazard. Okay, let's talk about threats for a little bit, unless I have any questions. Mike, do I have anything?
Yeah, you have one question from Chris. Have you seen any actual exploitations of AI solutions?
So we have not engaged yet with people that are doing AI projects. We are just starting to delve into that. There's an initiative here at the lab for, well, there's a couple. One is all about using AI, and then another one that is all about cybersecurity for AI to make those AI things more secure. And also, there's a lot of research going on in how to use AI for security, which then leads you to need to have security for your AI. So you start to get into a loop. We are talking with those folks. We have not engaged projects that are doing it, but it's kind of on our list of capabilities to grow. Okay, so now we're going to talk about how to minimize the means for achieving those unacceptable outcomes. That's what threat-based analysis is. So this is from the threat context. So we're not going to talk about adversaries and their motives. We're going to talk about the STRIDE model, spoofing, tampering, etc. So we're looking at the system from a different perspective now. We don't know who might spoof. We just want to look at the fact that spoofing can happen. This starts with, like I said before, a network diagram, and then the CIA triad: confidentiality, integrity, and availability, and the STRIDE model. So when we engage with a project here, we are actually sitting down and drawing a diagram on the whiteboard for them, or with them, I should say. Usually they're holding the marker while they draw. We often watch the development team debate with each other on what the diagram is supposed to be. You know, somebody up at the board draws a line and somebody on the team says that's not the right place. And, you know, we start this conversation and then we let them go at it. And there's often debate, and we sit back and we are often waiting until they're done. And then we start asking some questions, and then the diagram changes again. And often they come to us with diagrams they've had, but we always have this initial conversation so that we can know that we're getting a diagram that's in the perspective of threat, and that team agrees on is a good enough diagram. So engagement, again, we really tout the value of engagement. Then we also ask them to prioritize. What do you care about most? Confidentiality, availability, or integrity? And often we care about all three equally, and then we force the issue, because yes, we all do care equally about all of them usually, but typically if you talk long enough, something's going to matter more. You know, in the case of the building management system, let's use power grid in general. If you're doing power grid security, which we do a lot of out here, availability is the most important, because people need to turn their lights on. If they can't turn their lights on, the world goes bad. And so availability trumps confidentiality and integrity all day long in power grid. Not that the other two aren't important, but it's very clear being able to turn a light on is better than not knowing for sure who's on the network. That kind of thing. And we want to know those things, so we talk about it. And then the other thing we talk about here is NIST, the 853 document. It's a document developed by NIST that maybe many of you have heard of, but it lists all the different sort of standards by which you can implement controls. We don't do compliance with standards, really. We want to go from a security perspective first, but compliance is important. So when we do have a threat profile in hand, we go through and map it to NIST. And so that's what this little square is talking about. And then just like we had with consequence, we've got these things we call threat profiles that go out to the same audiences for the same reasons and divided up into the same ways to help increase communication. Threat analysis leads to actionable requirements and controls. We can do threat analysis if you don't have a system yet and you're in the early stages. You can find new requirements, or you can influence the design. This also provides a means to justify the security measures you might want to take. We haven't developed anything yet, or we have developed something, but here are the security measures. Here are the threats that can happen. Here are the potential mitigations we could have. And then again, like we had before, threat-based, we're providing the foundation for a risk assessment from a threat perspective. The last leaf in the Shamrock, trying to minimize exposure, eliminate vulnerabilities. And so let's talk about that for a second. So in this case, it's the vulnerability context that we're looking at the system. We looked at it from an adversary perspective, from a threat perspective, and now from a vulnerability perspective. And in the case of software here, we're talking about things I've already mentioned. Static analysis, scanning the source code; dynamic analysis, scanning the operating software as it's behaving; and then software component analysis and third-party things like that, leading to vulnerability profiles. And here, there's not as much engagement because we're looking at the code. We're getting down into the details of the technologies here. And so we're typically looking at source code, but then finding things to say about the source code using vulnerability scan results. We go through, and our experts are taking those results, weeding out a bunch of false positives, because everybody knows that a lot of these tools produce a lot of false positives. And we're providing recommendations back to development teams that they can act on and go fix and can communicate back to stakeholders. And I think I talked about those three things already. So how do we tie it all back to risk? Here's kind of where we start to get into the mission risk analysis. And the idea is there's this riskometer down below, and we start out here. When we see that unacceptable consequences, what they are, we start to get a little concerned and the needle bumps up. When unacceptable consequences align with plausible threats, then we might get a little worried. Hey, we've taken the consequence-based analysis, mapped it to MITRE, taken the threat analysis and looked at that and found threats that line up with MITRE, which line up with unacceptable outcomes. We start to get worried. Then if we find that when unacceptable consequences align with plausible threats, that can be exploited in existing vulnerabilities, then the riskometer thing moves all the way up to scared, because now we have a real path in a system that we can show this vulnerability enables this threat that leads to this unacceptable consequence. Those are the things that are the most risky. Those are the things that go to the top of the list in our mission risk analysis results. So those are the kinds of things we're looking for when we do these things with a team and do all three components of Shamrock analysis. So when unacceptable consequences align with plausible threats that can be exploited in existing system vulnerabilities, then money, business, reputation, operations, life, whatever the system is, all of these things could be at risk. We want to mitigate those things first that have all three of these things in common. And when we know and understand the consequences, anticipate and mitigate the threats, and find and eliminate vulnerabilities, then we're able to discover and reduce risk. And that's when we go back down to, I'll never put the needle below concerned, right? We're always going to be concerned. And we're never going to guarantee that everything's perfectly safe. But we do want to be low on the riskometer as best we can. That's kind of everything. We are using a lot of different techniques and a lot of different technologies. I thought I'd kind of conclude with, not only are we engaging projects to do these kinds of analyses, but there are other kinds of work that our team does that is stemmed out from this. One of them is what we call the SWAG, a software assurance guidebook. We've got a sponsor, government sponsor, who has asked us to basically formally document everything I've just talked to you about into the details so that they can do software assurance analyses for themselves. And that's what they're tasked with in their organization. So we've just recently published this guidebook for them. Crater has two things I want to talk about. This is what I'm most excited, and Aris, you will recognize that some of the things we wanted to do back when you were an intern with us are now starting to happen. Crater is a horrible acronym, and I'll spare you the story of the debate that a different guy who I work with and I had on calling it Shamrock versus calling it Crater, and I'll explain that. But it stands for Continuous Risk Analysis Infrastructure for Discovery and Reduction, Crater. What it is, well, before I say exactly what it is, I'll say kind of what we're doing. We're SBOM, Software Bill of Materials. In case you don't know what that is, a software bill of materials is basically the list of all the components that make up a piece of software, whether you wrote that piece or not. If I write a piece of software and download a library from someone else, that third-party library probably downloaded other third-party APIs, and we've got this big long list of components. A software bill of materials is essentially a list of all of those components that you can then take and look for vulnerabilities. You know, you can scan, not scan, but you can go out to the common weaknesses and common vulnerabilities databases and look for vulnerabilities from a component standpoint. We are using SBOMs as input to our Shamrock analysis and trying to do with that third thing there says continuous shamrocking. Everything I described to you has been something we've done manually, and it takes a lot of time. And that's a weakness because we do a threat profile and a consequence profile and a risk dossier, and it takes us a couple of months. And then by the time we give it back, things have happened. And the thing we just handed you might be out of date already. And so we're doing a pilot. We've been funded to do a pilot to automate and streamline a lot of these processes so that it doesn't take so long, with the ultimate goal being it's automated to the point where this is kind of happening continuously rather than once every few months. So our pilot is using these software bill of materials as input rather than source code scans or dynamic scans. We're using SBOMs because that's what this sponsor wanted us to use. But it's all the same thing, looking for vulnerabilities, inputting into Crater, and letting Crater find linkages between the threats and the vulnerabilities for us, finding links between the threats and the consequence-based things for us. We're looking into large language models and other AI techniques to find these linkages. Our current intern, Phoebe, I don't know if she's on the phone today or not, but she's also from Purdue. And I wanted to mention her here when I got to the Crater. She's helping us with some of the studies of the large language models, doing a fantastic job last summer, and is continuing to work with us now and helping with some of these automation techniques. So the idea is shamrocking is this process I've just described to you. Crater is the tool suite that enables it to be automated and fast. And we're expanding our capability using that, and we're really excited about all of that. And then the last thing that I wanted to bring up is there's another project called Connected Communities. It's a lot of power grid research, a lot of projects, 10 different projects around the country that are doing grid research to help communities, buildings, stadiums, apartment complexes be smartly linked to be energy efficient. A lot of work going on in that area. They're all required to write cybersecurity plans for obvious reasons. If you're dealing with those kinds of things, there's potential for bad things to happen in the cyber world. They've asked us for these 10 nationwide projects. Our team is consulting with them basically and helping them write their cybersecurity plans. And so we're applying our Shamrock techniques to the development of cybersecurity plans. So the work we're doing is expanding. There's research going on in AI. There's research going on in automation. There's research going on in process improvement. And then there's this process for providing services to different projects, different private industry. And I really like doing it. Our team really likes doing it. And I'm really glad that I had a chance to talk to you all about it. I know you're doing things in your studies and in your internships and things like that. If you're doing cyber work, this probably is somewhere related to what you're doing. And I hope this gives you kind of a little insight into what's going on out in the national lab research and development space on the kinds of things that we're doing, trying to tie all these different consequence, threats, vulnerabilities into something actionable for stakeholders and the development teams that build these systems. I'm all done. I think I'm even a little out of breath. So if we got questions, I'm happy to answer them at this point. I really appreciate you letting me talk for a while.
Hey, Chance. Yeah, thanks a lot. So let's catch your breath. We got a question here from I'm sorry, how do you pronounce it? Charis or Therese?
Haris, yeah. This is
Haris.
like the intern from Chance. Yeah.
Yes, I'll just read it. Each of the Shamrock process leads to a report delivered to 3 groups of people. However, those reports are related as, for instance, you have found an actual vulnerability that leads to an exploitation of a threat. Do you provide a unified report that explains the findings from all 3 processes?
Yes, and that's where Haris, when you were working with us, we didn't really have much of a concept of the risk dossier, but we now do. And that risk dossier, we've got 2 versions of it. One is a table that shows here's where the threat came from, here's where the vulnerability came from, here's the MITRE tactics and techniques that it maps to, and here's the consequence that it goes to, all in one table. And it's a fairly technical portion of the report. But we've also got what we call a visual risk dossier, which is more for stakeholders. And it just has graphs that show here is the threat and its vulnerabilities. And if you see an abuse case in a bubble on a graph, that is the one that's attached to the most vulnerabilities. Or if you see a vulnerability in the graph that is attached to the most abuse cases leading to the most outcomes, that's a very quick pictorial symbol that's the vulnerability you need to take care of. And so that's where we've done a lot of work and done a lot of improvement on making this stuff available in a risk dossier for the right audience that we didn't have before.
Yeah, I think we don't have any questions on the board. So in case I have a question, thank you, Chance, for the really interesting talk. So I have a broader question that how do you feel over the years cybersecurity research has evolved, at least for the last 10, 15 years?
How has cyber research evolved? Is that what you said?
Yeah. Because so I work on like 5G or network security sort of area. So I see like a lot of systems that were designed previously, not assuming any security guarantees in mind. So people now started patching those networks, try to have more security and privacy defenses. So it like at least what we feel in our research that they were not designed to uh, keeping the whole nowadays the cybersecurity atmosphere and the cybersecurity mindset when they were designed at the first place. So that's why I asked like how this evolved throughout the years. Was previously it was a kind of a back end thing. Now people are starting to more taking it seriously as a integral part of the system.
Yes, I have seen that grow and change a lot. as a quick, easy example, back when I was just a software developer and not a cyber person at all, I disabled my screensaver password because it was a nuisance. And, I wouldn't even keep my job today. So things have definitely changed a lot. And in terms of software development, yes, it was, first there was no security. Then when this became an issue and vulnerabilities and hacking started happening, even here at the lab, software development efforts, whether it was software developed internally for use by our own business systems or research projects, the software was developed and then handed to our IT cyber folks, the people who do incident response for our lab. The software was given to them at the end of the development lifecycle. They would do some scans and say, we can't release this because we found these vulnerabilities. And that would go back to the developers and they would say, well, we were budgeted to develop this software and we don't have any money left and our deliverable is now. We can't fix the vulnerabilities. We're out of budget. Our sponsor wants the software. And the IT team was like, we can't release this. So there was a lot of this that would go on. And that has changed a lot here at the lab to where security by design is much bigger of a thing. And I'd like to say our team has had something to do with that shift, not all of it. We did not come in and save the day by any means, but we were promoting this back when it needed to be promoted, and others promoted it too. And a lot of that has changed. And you'll see, I don't know if you all know what CISA, the cyber critic, I always forget because their acronym is so weird. Critical Infrastructure, Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency. Yeah. They are very much pushing this secure by design effort in both private industry vendors making software for government and in like research labs and research and development to get methods for doing security at the beginning into people's life cycles. And they've got what they call what do they call it? The Secure by Design Pledge. Have you heard of any of this?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so it's really becoming more and more prevalent that people find out ways to do this. And we've seen here at the lab, you were asking about the evolution of research. We've seen research going into how can we bring this earlier into the development process. And not only research, but engineering techniques too. We're doing scans as we build so that the vulnerabilities get reported right away. But that creates problems because I've got these thousands of vulnerabilities that I'm getting every day now. Do I really want to be fixing those in the middle of my development lifecycle? So that's where our process, I hope, will come in. And we're doing these automated crater things that say, these are the ones you really ought to fix before you move to the next level.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. It's really insightful. Yeah, I am happy that we are going into a better direction thinking about secure by design. Because for our case, for network security, it's really hard to patch things up to make it work unless there is something major that is changed.
Yep. I recently went to a talk that's kind of pertinent to your question too. They gave a talk on the vulnerability scans that, there are lots of tools. We use check marks here because the lab did an investment in check marks. And there are many different tools, check marks and Fortify and blah, blah, blah. And they're all reporting and they're all changing. You get a new version of check marks, you get a different vulnerability scan. And they're doing data science on saying, okay, we don't care which tool is best. We're going to take the data from all of them and start to measure the security of the software based on scanning them with all the tools. And they're finding ways to measure quality, cyber quality of the software based on a bunch of ambiguous scans without having to determine which ones are false positives or not. It was a very interesting talk. And that certainly is great research for being able to know where does my software stand today without having to worry about which scanner should I have. And it looks like I better be quiet. We're out of time, aren't we?
Yeah. Thank you. Let's thank our speaker. Thank you, Chance. It was really insightful talk. Yeah, I hope to meet you someday if I visit that side of the country, definitely.
Yeah, well, and I'm hoping to come back to Purdue again at sometime in the future too.
Thank you. Really nice to meet you.